The process of photosynthesis is a process in which plants, in particular the green leaves of plants, can produce sugar using simple starting materials in their environment. The two basic ingredients to make sugar are carbon dioxide, which has one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. There are double bonds between the carbon and the oxygen atoms. And then water. Here we have one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms in one water molecule. And sugar, glucose, is this molecule over here. It's C6H12O6. 6 carbon atoms, the black ones, 12 hydrogen atoms, the white ones, and 6 oxygen atoms, the blue ones. The process of photosynthesis also produces oxygen gas as a waste product. Notice the double bonds between the two oxygen atoms. So again, in general, plants are going to use these two simple starting materials, carbon dioxide and water, to build sugar. That's the goal of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide enters the plant through small openings on the underside of leaves called stomata. So carbon dioxide from the air can enter the plant through stomata. Of course, the roots of the plant are responsible for delivering water molecules up from the roots, up the stem, and into the cells of the leaf. It's in the leaf then where special molecules called chlorophyll molecules cover the surface of chloroplasts. And this is a vial of chlorophyll in alcohol. So we took a leaf and we boiled it and extracted out the chlorophyll. This molecule, chlorophyll, has certain properties when it interacts with light. It reflects green light, and that's why we see leaves as green. However, chlorophyll also absorbs the red and the blue light, and that's the energy that the plant will be capturing to power the process of photosynthesis. So if we think about the starting materials again, these two kinds of molecules, carbon dioxide and water, provide the necessary atoms to build sugar over here. But obviously the atoms are arranged differently in a sugar molecule than they are over here in the starting materials. So the plant has to rearrange the atoms of the starting materials to make the final product, glucose. But the atoms in the starting materials are strongly bonded together. There are chemical bonds that are keeping these atoms together in this carbon dioxide molecule, for example. It takes energy to break these chemical bonds so that the atoms can be liberated and then rearranged to form glucose. The energy to break these chemical bonds then is where sunlight comes in. The chlorophyll molecules inside the leaf cells, in particular on the chloroplasts, the chlorophyll molecules are going to absorb the red and the blue light. Recall that white light has all the colors of the spectrum, and the chlorophyll then absorbs the reds and the blues principally, reflecting the greens and the yellows. That's the energy that is required to break these chemical bonds and reassemble the atoms of carbon dioxide and water into glucose. Now let's get a little bit more specific. The carbon in carbon dioxide is the carbon that ends up in glucose. The hydrogen of water is the hydrogen that ends up in glucose. And we can see that must be the case because carbon dioxide is the only source of carbon and water is the only source of hydrogen to make the final product, glucose. The oxygen atoms in glucose, however, could theoretically come from either of the starting materials. They both have oxygen. Researchers did experiments in which they made some of these starting materials with radioactive oxygen atoms. So for example, you can, in a sense, provide a plant with carbon dioxide that has radioactive oxygen atoms in it. And this will allow scientists then to follow, to trace where the radioactive oxygen atoms end up. Do they end up in the glucose, or do they end up being released by the plant as waste? Well, when you make the oxygen atoms of carbon dioxide radioactive, when you, in a sense, tag them so we can follow them, you find that the glucose has radioactive oxygens in it. And the oxygen liberated by the plant is not radioactive. On the other hand, when you make water molecules with radioactive oxygen atoms, you find that the glucose has no radioactive oxygen atoms, and the released oxygen is radioactive. So what this tells us is that the oxygen in glucose is coming from carbon dioxide. The oxygen in water molecules is released as waste. So plants use sunlight energy to build glucose, and they need the energy to break the chemical bonds of the starting materials and rearrange those atoms to form the sugar. In particular, the energy of this process is used to split water molecules to provide that source of hydrogen, and oxygen is liberated as a waste. And then further energy is necessary to take the atoms of carbon dioxide, to break these bonds between the atoms and take those atoms and rearrange them to form glucose. The oxygen released by photosynthesis, of course, is necessary for animals to breathe, but plants don't release this oxygen for the benefit of animals. This oxygen is a waste product in this complicated process called photosynthesis. Now it turns out, though, that like animal cells, plant cells also need some oxygen. They need oxygen because once they've made their glucose, the sugar, they're going to turn around and burn it, to metabolize it, to break it down to get energy. So the process of photosynthesis builds sugar inside chloroplasts, and then the plant cell is going to break down the sugar to get energy. It's like making your lunch and then eating it. The breakdown of sugar always requires oxygen, just as in animal cells. For thousands of years, people believed that new plant tissue came from the soil. As plants grew, they converted soil into leaves and stems. In Aristotle's time, farmers complained that over time their crop production would decrease, as if plants were using up the soil. It wasn't until the 1600s that somebody decided to put that idea to the test. His name was Van Helmont. He did a simple experiment. He took a 5-pound plant and potted it in 200 pounds of soil. After 5 years of regular watering, he simply measured the weight of the plant and the soil again. He found that the plant had gained 165 pounds and the soil had lost 2 ounces. Van Helmont concluded that soil was not being used as a major factor in building new plant tissue. Rather, new plant tissue came from water. Now, we can celebrate Van Helmont for his experimental approach, but he neglected to go farther to test whether water alone was being used by the plant. Perhaps the plant uses water and something else. Stephen Hales did a similar experiment as Van Helmont did, except he used water instead of soil. So he got a plant, one that would be able to grow just in water alone. He measured the weight of the plant and the weight of the water initially, allowed the plant to grow, measured the weight of the new plant material, and measured how much water was used, the weight of the water that was missing. If plants converted 100% of the water into new tissue, then the weight of the new plant gained should be equal to the weight of the lost water. What Hales found was that the plant gained more weight than the water that was used. He concluded that plants must use something in addition to water. Perhaps that something was a substance in the air. To confirm that plants were absorbing something from the air, Hales had to set up a chamber like this. He had a pan of water, took a jar with an open end at the bottom, so it's an inverted jar, and it's resting in the water. Now, to understand Hales's result, we need to understand a little bit about air pressure. Right now, air molecules are bouncing around into each other and into the jar and into the surface of the water. As air molecules bounce into water molecules, it's exerting a force on the water molecules, pushing them down. The force of air pressure on the surface of the water here will tend to push the water up inside the jar. But if we had just put the jar down like this, there's also, of course, air inside the jar. And so there are air molecules bouncing around inside, also pushing down on the water. So the level of the water inside the jar is going to depend on the pressure difference outside compared to inside. If we remove air from inside the vessel with a vacuum pump, then there are fewer molecules bouncing around, exerting force on the water inside. With less air pressure inside, the outside air pressure can push the water farther up the jar. If we inject air into the chamber, there's greater air pressure inside, and that greater air pressure will push the water down inside the vessel, and the water outside in the pan will go up. Incidentally, when you remove all the air from a chamber like this, you have effectively made a barometer, a device that measures air pressure. The height of the column of water, the weight of that column, is a measure of the atmospheric air pressure. When atmospheric air pressure increases, that increased pressure can push the column of water, or mercury, as is often used, higher into the chamber. So, what Hales did was then have a chamber like this, inverted chamber, in a pan of water. He then placed a plant inside the chamber. And to simulate that, we'll just take a piece of this. Okay, so after several days, he watched what happened to the water level inside the jar. What he noticed was that the water level rose inside the jar. Now, one could say, well, maybe the outside air pressure increased and this pushed the water up higher into the jar. Well, like a good scientist, Hales had a control condition, a jar with no plant in it. And that water level stayed the same. So the increase in water level inside the jar, Hales interpreted this as the result of something the plant was doing to the air pressure inside the chamber. Now, if we think about why water level would go up, if the outside air pressure remained the same, what must have been happening was the inside air pressure was changing, was being reduced. With less inside air pressure, the outside air pressure could push the water a little bit higher. So the plant was somehow reducing the air pressure, Hales concluded. And that's exactly what would be happening, he thought, if the plant were absorbing something from the air. So for Hales, this confirmed that plants not only use water to build new tissue, but also are absorbing something from the air. When chemists began to chemically analyze the materials in plants, they found a lot of carbon, especially in the form of glucose, carbon-rich molecule. Now, if we think about where a plant is getting carbon from, it was long known that plants require water to survive. But as we can see here, water does not have carbon atoms. So water cannot be the only starting material to build new plant tissue. If plants have carbon and water does not have carbon, there must be something else with carbon that the plant is using. Hales directed our attention to something in the air, and later on, chemists discovered that air is a mixture of gases, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide. And so this now sort of brought the pieces together. Plants are absorbing something from the air. That something we suspect has carbon in it, and there is, in fact, carbon dioxide in the air. So if carbon dioxide were to enter a plant, it would be a source of carbon to build sugar. Scientists have discovered small openings on the underside of leaves. They're called stomata. And initially they wondered then perhaps these openings were the sites of entry for carbon dioxide. A guy by the name of Julius Sachs performed a simple experiment. If carbon dioxide was really entering the leaves through these openings, and carbon dioxide is necessary to build sugar, then if you block these openings, the plant should not be able to build sugar. Julius Sachs covered the bottoms of leaves with wax to try and plug up the stomata. And in fact, he found that such leaves could not build sugar. And that supported the hypothesis that carbon dioxide enters the leaf through stomata. If you block carbon dioxide entry, the plant cannot make sugar. It's lacking its source of carbon. Another piece of the puzzle for how plants grow was contributed by a guy by the name of Ingenhousz. And he set up a chamber like this. This is an aquatic plant down here in a chamber of water, and this test tube here was initially filled with water and put on top of this dome that the plant is in. So any gases that the plant produces can be collected in this tube and analyzed. What Ingenhousz found was that the green parts of plants produce some carbon dioxide but a lot of oxygen. And this only happened when light was shining on the plant. So Ingenhousz discovered that light shining on the green parts of plants cause the green parts to produce a lot of oxygen. Without the light, the green parts only produced small levels of carbon dioxide gas. He also analyzed the parts of plants that are non-green. So he put the stems and the roots and the seeds, the non-green parts of plants, in a similar chamber and measured the gas production. What he found was that the non-green parts of plants only produced carbon dioxide. They did not produce oxygen. And it did not matter whether light was shining on them or not. So Ingenhousz then found that all parts of the plant produce carbon dioxide. And only the green parts produce oxygen, and only when they are exposed to light. We now know that all plant parts are producing carbon dioxide because they are burning sugar. The sugar that they make during photosynthesis is being used as a chemical energy source. As it is burned, oxygen is required to burn the sugar, but when the sugar is burned, carbon dioxide is again produced, as well as water. Whenever we burn sugar, we produce carbon dioxide and water as waste. And this would explain then why it is that all plant parts are producing some carbon dioxide, because they are burning sugar. The amazing things that plants can do is plants can build sugar. And they build sugar by this process called photosynthesis. This overview of photosynthesis is that plants harness solar energy to take the overview of photosynthesis is as follows. Plants can convert solar energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose. They build glucose from simple starting materials in their environment. Carbon dioxide enters the plant through stomata. Water enters the plant through the roots. Both are delivered to the leaf cells. In the leaf cells, specifically in the chloroplasts, a molecule called chlorophyll captures light and uses that captured energy to break the chemical bonds of the starting materials so the atoms can be rearranged to form sugar, glucose. In the process, oxygen is liberated as a waste material. However, it's only a waste material of the photosynthesis process, which is again the building of sugar. Because this oxygen, while much of it is produced and much of it leaves the plant to go out into the atmosphere, some of this oxygen is necessary for the plant to be able to burn the sugar that it just made. So plants build sugar by photosynthesis and then they burn the sugar that they just created. This is why the green parts of plants produce two kinds of gases. Some carbon dioxide as they are burning the sugar. Carbon dioxide would be a waste of that process. And then a lot of oxygen as they are building new sugar molecules, harnessing the sun's energy, turning it into chemical energy.